The air in the auction house was a thick, foul stew, smelling of unwashed bodies, stale sweat, and the metallic tang of fear. Elara kept her head down, the rough spun cowl of her cloak scratching at her chin. She did not belong here. The men who frequented the flesh market in the Undercity were brutes and opportunists, their pockets heavy with coin and their souls corroded by avarice. Her own pocket held only a small, soft leather pouch, its contents the meager sum of her existence, 37 copper pieces and 2 dented silvers. It was rent money. It was food for the next month. It was the entirety of her world, a fragile barrier against the gnawing hunger of the streets. Her heart, a frantic bird against the cage of her ribs, beat a rhythm of pure folly. Coming here was madness, an indulgence born of a whispered rumor that had caught fire in her mind and refused to be extinguished. They said a wolf had been caught. Not some common soldier or a debtor sold into servitude, but an alpha of the northern clans, a warlord whose name was once spoken with terrified reverence. To see such a person brought low, shackled and sold like livestock, the thought was a morbid fascination, a dark magnet pulling her into this pit of human misery. She had told herself she only wanted to look, to witness the impossible. But the weight of the coins in her pocket felt less like security and more like a weapon waiting to be fired. A useless, pathetic weapon against the monolithic cruelty of this place. She should leave. Turn around, push back through the throng of leering men, and return to the cold solitude of her single room. But her feet were stone, rooted to the grimy floor. Then the iron-bound door at the side of the stage groaned open, and a hush fell over the crowd, thick and expectant. 2 hulking guards shoved a figure forward into the greasy yellow light of the oil lamps. It was her, the Alpha. Elara's breath hitched, trapped in her throat. The rumors had not done her justice, nor had they captured the depth of her fall. She was tall, even with her shoulders slumped in a posture of forced submission. Her hair, the color of spun moonlight, was matted with grime and blood. Bruises, ugly and purple, marred the sharp line of her jaw and the high plane of her cheekbones. She wore rags that did little to hide the powerful musculature of her frame, or the cruel iron collar locked around her throat. A heavy chain snaked from it, held by one of the guards. She was a beast on a leash. But her eyes were not broken. As she was forced onto the raised block in the center of the stage, she lifted her head, and her gaze swept over the jeering crowd. They were the color of a winter storm, chips of ice that held no fear, only a chilling, bottomless contempt. In them, Elara saw not a victim, but a queen surveying a pit of vipers. Dignity was her last remaining armor, a mantle of invisible steel she wore over her tattered clothes and broken body. The men laughed, their voices coarse and ugly, but their laughter held a nervous edge. They saw the same thing Elara did. This was a fire not yet extinguished, only banked. The auctioneer, a fleshy man with a gavel and a smile that didn't reach his eyes, began his spiel. A prize tonight, gentlemen. A true rarity. Strong, healthy, and with a spirit that needs taming. His words were a physical blow, and Elara watched the Alpha's jaw tighten, a single muscle twitching in her temple. This was an ignominy beyond reckoning. To be reduced to chattel, her worth measured in the clinking of coin. The bidding began, and it was an insult. A lowball offer thrown out by a merchant with piggish eyes, followed by another, only marginally higher. They were not bidding on her strength or her lineage, they were bidding on the pleasure of breaking her. Elara could hear it in their smug, guttural calls. They wanted to own this legend, to shatter her pride and turn her into a trophy. The price crept upward, agonizingly slow. 10 silvers. 12. 15. A pittance. The cost of a good draft horse. Elara's hand strayed to her pouch, her fingers closing around the worn, cool metal of the coins. The feel of them was a sharp, painful reminder of her own precarious existence. 37 coppers, 2 silvers. It was nothing. It was everything. She could not. It was impossible. She would be on the street by week's end, begging for scraps. A tremor went through her, a violent shudder of indecision. The auctioneer was scanning the crowd, his gaze oily and impatient. 15 silver for the Alpha. A bargain, I say. Will I hear 16? Going once. The words echoed in the sudden quiet. The men were content. 15 silvers was enough to claim their prize, to begin the cruel process of subjugation. The Alpha on the block stood perfectly still, her spine a rod of iron. She seemed to be looking at nothing, her focus turned inward, to some last, inviolable fortress within herself. But Elara saw the faint tremor in her hands, the whitening of her knuckles where her fists were clenched. It was a crack in the armor, a glimpse of the terror beneath the pride. Her heart cracked with it. Duty to herself, to her own survival, warred with a wild, inexplicable impulse, a scream of defiance against the world's casual cruelty. She had never been brave. She had spent her life being small, being quiet, being invisible. But in this moment, invisibility felt like a sin. Her fingers tightened on the pouch until her knuckles ached. Going twice. The auctioneer raised his gavel, a smug finality in the gesture. The world narrowed to that upraised piece of wood, the Alpha's rigid back, and the crushing weight of Elara's own cowardice. No. A voice, fierce and unfamiliar, rose from the depths of her soul. No. Before she could think, before she could let the cold calculus of survival choke the word back down her throat, she acted. Her own voice was a stranger to her ears, thin and reedy, but cutting through the thick, expectant air. 3 silvers, a gasp rippled through the crowd. Not for the amount, it was a laughable bid, a pathetic increase. They gasped because of who had spoken. Heads turned, a sea of hostile, disbelieving faces staring at the small, cloaked figure in the back. Elara felt 100 pairs of eyes on her, stripping her bare. The auctioneer squinted, his fleshy face contorting in confusion. What was that? Who bids 3 silvers? He meant 3 whole silver coins, a standard increment. But that was not what she had. She took a shaky breath, her entire body trembling. This was the precipice. She had to make them understand. She raised her chin, pulling the last of her courage around her like a shield. Not 3, she clarified, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. 3 and 37 coppers, she had named her entire fortune. The silence that followed was absolute, profound. It was a silence of pure, unadulterated shock. Then, a man in the front row let out a bark of laughter, and it broke the spell. The room erupted in jeers and mocking catcalls. They thought it was a joke. Elara's face burned with humiliation, but she held her ground. Her gaze, however, was not on them. It was on the woman on the block. For the first time, the Alpha moved. Her head turned slowly, deliberately, and those winter storm eyes found Elara in the crowd. There was no pity in them, no gratitude. There was only a piercing, unnerving intensity, a silent question that seemed to see straight through Elara's skin and into the frantic, foolish beating of her heart. The auctioneer, his face flushed with anger at the disruption, slammed his gavel down. Enough of this mockery. The bid stands at 15 sil, but the pig-eyed merchant who held the bid was staring at Elara, then at the Alpha, a slow, cruel smile spreading across his face. He saw the game. Let her have her, he sneered, waving a dismissive hand. The street rat and the fallen wolf. They deserve each other's misery. He withdrew his bid, not out of kindness, but out of a deeper cruelty. He was condemning them both. The auctioneer, seeing his profit vanish, looked furious, but a deal was a deal. He glared at Elara. Sold, he spat, his voice dripping with disgust. To the beggar in the back. For the grand sum of nothing, the gavel fell with a sharp, final crack. It was done. Elara felt a wave of dizziness, so profound she had to grip the shoulder of the man in front of her to stay upright. She had done it. She had saved her. And in doing so, she had damned them both to starvation. The transaction was a quiet humiliation. Elara was summoned to a grimy side room, where she emptied the contents of her pouch onto a scarred wooden table. The 2 silvers gleamed weakly in the lamplight, surrounded by the dull, earthy brown of the 37 copper pieces. The clerk counted it with a sneer, then shoved a piece of parchment at her, a bill of sale, marking 1 human life as property. Her property. The word tasted like ash in her mouth. When she emerged, the Alpha was waiting, the iron collar still around her neck, but the chain lying loose on the floor. A guard handed Alara the cold, heavy links. The responsibility was now hers. The woman stood, her gaze fixed on Alara, her expression unreadable. For a long moment, they just looked at each other, the noise of the continuing auction a distant murmur. The power dynamic had been shattered and reformed into something terrifying and unknown. Alara was her savior, her owner, her keeper. And yet, standing before the sheer, formidable presence of the Alpha, Alara felt like the one who had just been colored. She gave a small, jerky nod toward the exit, her throat too dry to speak. The Alpha followed without a word. The walk through the damp, labyrinthine streets of the Undercity was a silent, tense ordeal. Alara clutched the chain, the cold iron biting into her palm, but she let it hang slack between them. She would not lead this woman like an animal. The Alpha walked a half-step behind her, her tread unnervingly light for a person of her size. Her presence was a palpable weight on the air, a storm cloud of suppressed power that made the hairs on Alara's arms stand on end. Every footstep echoed in the narrow alleyways, a two-part rhythm of their shared, uncertain future. They arrived at the tenement building where Alara lived, a sagging structure that seemed to be held up by sheer willpower and the press of its neighbors. Her room was on the 4th floor, up a flight of stairs that groaned under their combined weight. She fumbled with the key, her hands shaking so badly it took 3 tries to get the lock to turn. The door swung inward, revealing the entirety of her world, a small, clean room containing a narrow cot, a small table with 1 chair, and a single, grime-streaked window overlooking a lightless alley. It was a pathetic kingdom, and she had just brought a dethroned queen into it. The space seemed to shrink instantly, crowded by the Alpha's sheer existence. She stepped inside, her storm-gray eyes taking in the sparse surroundings in a single, sweeping glance. Alara watched her, her heart pounding a nervous tattoo against her sternum. She saw the room not as she knew it, a safe, if lonely, haven, but through the Alpha's eyes, a cage. A small, pathetic cage. "It's not much," Alara whispered, the words sounding feeble and inadequate. The Alpha said nothing. She simply moved to the center of the room and stood there, a statue carved from moonlight and defiance. The silence stretched, becoming a living thing between them, thick with unspoken questions and a tension so sharp Alara could taste it. Desperate to do something, to perform the role of a host and not a jailer, Alara turned to her meager pantry, a small wooden crate in the corner. Inside was a half-loaf of stale bread and a clay jug of water. It was all she had left in the world. With trembling hands, she broke off a piece of the bread and filled a chipped cup with water, placing them on the table. She gestured toward it, a silent offering. "Please," she managed to say. For a long moment, the Alpha didn't move. She just watched Alara, her gaze so intense it felt like a physical touch. Alara held her breath, certain she would refuse. Then, with a slow, deliberate grace that seemed at odds with her bruised and battered state, she moved to the table. She did not sit. She remained standing as she picked up the bread, her movements economical and precise. She ate it slowly, methodically, as if committing the texture and taste to memory. She drank the water in 2 long swallows, then set the cup down with a soft click. Her eyes never left Alara's face. The act of sharing this last, pitiful meal was more intimate than any touch, a communion of 2 souls cast adrift on the same sea of desperation. When she was finished, the room fell silent again, but the quality of the silence had changed. The brittle tension had solidified into something heavier, something primal and inevitable. The wolf had been fed. The debt was being weighed. The Alpha pushed the cup gently back to the center of the table and turned her full attention to Alara. She took a step forward, then another. Alara instinctively backed away until her shoulders met the cold, unforgiving stone of the wall. There was nowhere left to run. The woman was a giantess, a predator, her shadow swallowing what little light filtered in from the street. Alara's throat went dry. Fear, sharp and cold, lanced through her. She had freed a wolf, and now she was trapped in a room with it. The Alpha stopped barely a hand's breadth away. She was close enough that Alara could feel the heat radiating from her body, could smell the scent clinging to her skin, not the filth of the prison, but something deeper, something wild and clean, like ozone after a lightning strike. She raised a hand, not to strike, but with a slowness that was terrifying in its deliberation. She gently took the chain from Alara's unresisting fingers and let it fall to the floor. The metallic clatter was deafening in the small room. Then she reached for the collar around her own neck. Her fingers fumbled with the lock, a complex mechanism that required a key Alara did not possess. A flicker of frustration crossed her features, the first genuine emotion Alara had seen. Her gaze dropped to meet Alara's, and she gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of her head. It was a concession, an admission of her own helplessness in this one small thing. She was still a prisoner. Then, her purpose seemed to shift. Her eyes darkened, the gray deepening to the color of slate. The air crackled. The predator was looking at her, seeing her. Not as a savior, not as an owner, but as something else entirely. Something necessary. She leaned in, her movements fluid and certain. Alara squeezed her eyes shut, her body rigid with a mixture of terror and a strange, aching anticipation. She expected pain, a blow, a punishment for her audacity. Instead, she felt the soft brush of the Alpha's breath against the side of her neck. A hot, tingling shock spread through her veins. The Alpha inhaled deeply, her nose brushing the sensitive skin below Alara's ear. It was a possessive, assessing gesture, an animal learning a scent. Her heart hammered so violently she thought it might break through her ribs. This was it. The claiming. It was not a thing of words, but of instinct and scent and the undeniable assertion of power. A low sound rumbled in the Alpha's chest, a sound that was not quite a growl, but something far more fundamental. It vibrated through Alara's bones, a primal declaration that resonated with a part of her she never knew existed. She had spent her life as a whisper, a shadow. To be the focus of such absolute, unwavering attention was both terrifying and intoxicating. "You," the Alpha breathed, her first word. It was not a question or a statement, but a designation. A naming. Her voice was a low rasp, rough with disuse, but carrying an unmistakable current of authority. And then, her lips brushed Alara's skin, followed by the sharp, sudden pressure of teeth. It was not a savage, tearing bite, but a firm, deliberate claiming. A mark. Pain, white-hot and electric, shot through her, and she cried out, a small, sharp sound. It was over as quickly as it began. The Alpha pulled back, her storm-gray eyes burning with a possessive fire. She had marked Alara as hers. The bill of sale was a worthless piece of paper. This was the real transaction, written in flesh and instinct. A bond, forged in desperation and sealed in dominance. Alara's trembling fingers rose to touch the stinging mark on her neck. The terror had not vanished, but something new was woven through it, a staggering, impossible sense of belonging. She had spent her last coin to save a fallen Alpha, and in return, she had been claimed by her. The future was a terrifying void, but as she looked into those fierce, protective eyes, she knew, for the first time in her small, quiet life, she would not be facing it alone.